Now we got Django installed, Python installed. We learned how we can create Django projects, and therefore now we are going to dive into a Django project and we are going to write our first code and build our first website with Django. In this course section, we are going to start with some core concepts of every Django application, every Django site, and therefore something you must know no matter what you're building. We are going to dive into URLs, a concept also often called routes, and views. And of course, I will explain what these two concepts are about, why we need them, and what they do. And therefore, in this course section, we are going to explore what URLs or routes and views are. We're going to understand how Django deals with HTTP requests and responses, because that's how the web works. It's all about requests and responses. And we are going to dive into how we can deliver content and process user input, at least to a certain extent. We're going to dive deeper into that later in other course sections as well, but we are going to get started with those important basics in this course section. And we are going to get started with this challenges app we're building, with this first course project, which helps us practice these basics. Now, this challenges app is a very simple app, but it will allow us to dive into these essentials. It's basically an application where we can visit different pages on our website. To be precise, we can visit different pages for the different months we have in a year. So we have a January page and a February page and a March page and so on. And we can see the different monthly challenges we have for these different months, like going for a walk for at least 20 minutes every day, or eating no meat for an entire month. These are the different challenges which we want to view on the different pages. And whilst this is a simple app, and at this point also arguably not a pretty app, it will be a first application, a first project, which allows us to thoroughly understand and practice these important basics. Now, for this course section, I want to create a brand new Django project. We could continue with the project we created in the last course section, but for one, I already want to practice again what we learned there so that you 100% know how to create Django projects. And in addition, I wasn't entirely happy with the project name. Because you might recall that in the last course section, we used the Django admin command, which is available because we installed Django globally with Python. We used this command to then run the start project subcommand and create a my page project. That's what we did in the last course section. Now, my page is a very generic name, not really very useful. Now, here, a better name could be Django course, since the app we're going to build, the first website we're going to build, will be part of this Django course. But in the last course section, you learned what Django projects are and what an app is in Django. And you learned that a project is made up of multiple apps, but overall, a project is then not a collection of totally detached, unrelated apps, but instead a Django project is made up of multiple apps which combined form the overall project, the overall website. And therefore here, the first website we are going to build is this challenges website, which is all about having these monthly challenges. Therefore, I'll name the project monthly_challenges, following the typical Python naming convention for folders, which contain an underscore if the word consists of multiple words. And I will create this brand new Django project here with this command. As a next step, I opened Visual Studio Code in a brand new window, and I'll again open a folder. You can also do this with File, Open here if you don't have that sidebar. And I will open this monthly challenges folder here. So that's now this new Django project opened up in Visual Studio Code. And in there, I'll now open my terminal and create a brand new Django app in this project. And that will be the challenges app. We do this by running Python 3 or just Python, depending on whether you have multiple Python versions installed on your system or not. Manage.py, start app, and then a name of your choice. And here I'll name this challenges, so that in the monthly challenges project, we have this challenges app, which will be responsible for displaying the challenges the user has. And if we then later would also add a feature for adding challenges, we could add another app, which we maybe name add or admin challenges or anything like that. But we don't need that here, so I will not add this app here. And we could also add such an admin functionality to the existing challenges app if we wanted to. It is always up to you whether you want to split features into multiple apps or merge them in one bigger app, which is part of that project. But that's also something we're going to take another look at later once we also build bigger demo applications. For the moment, we have the challenges app in this monthly challenges project, and that's now what I want to continue with. That's now where we will dive into the Python code and start writing some Python code on our own. Just two more things before we get started. I did make sure that I selected the correct interpreter for this project by again viewing this status bar and clicking on the chosen version down there and picking that Python version I installed in the last course section. That's one thing which I did here. And that gave me the VS Code folder with the settings.json file. And in that settings.json file, I also set the zoom level to a fixed value, which you don't need to do. I'm only doing that here for recording purposes. But I did add this Python language server entry here to use this other extension which we installed, the PyLens extension, for evaluating the Python code we're going to write. This is also something you might want to do to prepare your project for the code we're about to write. In addition, my folders and files here are green because I also initialized Git here. Git is a version control system which is 100% optional. You can learn more about Git with the attached article, but you don't have to. You don't have to use Git. It's 100% optional, and you don't have to dive into it if you don't know it yet. Now with that, let's continue, and let's dive into that challenges folder to start writing some Python code. So this course section is about two main things: URLs, or routes, as we could also call this concept, and views. Now, what are these things then? And let's start with URLs. What are URLs or routes? No matter which website you're visiting, you always do so by entering some URL like this. For example, if I want to visit my own website, academind.com, I can enter this into the browser bar. Or, of course, you always often just type what you want to search it, and then click on the result in Google. But either way, you end up with a URL being entered in that browser URL bar, and that's responsible for displaying this website. But on websites, you of course typically don't just have this root level URL. Instead, you can click on other items like tutorials or premium courses, and you will see that this URL up there changed. It now has a /courses at the end, or /tutorials. And that's of course not just the case for my own website here, but that's the case for basically any website out there in the web. If I visit Amazon.com, for example, I can click on today's deals or customer service, and you will see that that URL changes. So when building a website as a web developer, we have to plan which URLs we want to support. And there we might have that main URL with /nothing after that domain here, which loads the starting page. And then let's say if we're building a blog, we also want to have a /posts URL, which shows a list of all posts. So where we load a page that displays the posts. And we might then also drill in deeper and load /posts/Python is great to show a page for a very specific post. So the idea is that we have various URLs which lead to different results, different responses being sent back to the visitors of our website. And that's what this concept called URLs, or routes as it's also often called, all about. It's about mapping certain actions, certain things that should happen, to certain URLs. If I visit mypage.com/nothing, I want to show the starting page. So that HTML file that represents the starting page should be fetched and should be sent back. If I visit /posts, I want to fetch all posts, probably from a database, and then show those posts on an HTML page, which is being sent back. That's the idea behind URLs. And that's the first important part of this course section. And of course, we're going to learn how we can configure those supported URLs which we want in our project with help of Django. Now, the other important part of this course section are the views. Now, what are views? Well, the URLs are responsible for defining the URLs we want to support and the actions that should be triggered. Views then basically are those actions. Views are all about holding the concrete logic, the concrete Python code that should be executed for the different URLs and for different HTTP methods, which is something we're going to explore later in the course. A view in Django, in a Django project, in its simplest form is just a function full of Python code which is executed automatically by Django when a request for a certain URL reaches the Django server. It could also be a class. You have both options when working with Django, and we're going to see both options in action throughout this course. But we're going to start with a function, since that's the simplest way of writing logic that should execute when a request reaches a certain URL. And then the code in that view is simply code that handles the incoming request, does something like reach out to a database or whatever, and then returns a fitting response. And in a view, you typically perform tasks like loading and preparing data, running any other kind of business logic like encrypting passwords or something like that. And then you prepare and return the response data. For example, a HTML document that should be sent back to the client, so to the user visiting your website. That's a view. It's a function or a class holding the logic, so holding the code that should execute when a request reaches one of your supported URLs. So URLs and views work closely together, which is why this course section is about both. And now that we got the theory out of the way, let's write our first URL and view. So let's now finally get started with writing some code. And for that, I want to write our first view and also add our first URL. Now, first things first, I first of all want to restart my development server here so that we can preview the application. And we do this by running Python 3 manage py run server, which brings up this development server. I will minimize this here a bit. And now on localhost 8000, I can see this dummy starting page. Now the goal here for the moment is to create such a challenges website. And let's say we want to be able to visit /challenges here and then simply append something like January and then see our January challenge. That could be our first goal, since we're talking about monthly challenges here. Now, to achieve this, we want to go into the challenges folder, which we created, and there into the views py file. And in there, we can now create new views, which of course brings up the question what exactly a view is. But I mentioned before that a view is either a function or a class. We're going to see both in the course, but I want to start with a function here. And therefore, in the views py file, we can define a new Python function. And I will name it index for now, though that name is up to you. And in this function, I then want to return something. Now, what I want to return here should be the response that is being sent back to the client. So to the browser sending that request. And I also actually want to accept an argument here, a parameter. A parameter which will be passed in automatically into this function when it's executed. Because this function will not be executed by us by calling it somewhere else in our code. Instead, we will soon make Django aware of this function, and Django will execute this function for us when an incoming request hits this Django server and is forwarded to this function. Therefore, here we want to accept a request and we want to return a response, because that's this cycle which we have between our client, the user visiting our site, and our server. We exchange requests and responses. And it's the job of the views to process those requests, to maybe reach out to a database if we want to do that. We don't want to do it here, but we later will, and to then create and return a response. So we're getting the request. Now we want to return a HTTP response. And that actually is an object which I want to instantiate, and therefore I also need to import this object to reference it here. And we can import it from django.http. From there we can import the HTTP response. Now that instantiates the object by adding parentheses here. That is regular Python code. And as an argument to this constructor function which we're calling in the end here, HTTP response basically is a class which we're instantiating. So as an argument to this instructor function, we can pass our response data. So the data we want to send back to the client. That could be a HTML file, though we'll dive into that later. For the moment, I'll send back a string. I will send back a string where I say, this works. And we can fine-tune this later. Now I pressed the auto format shortcut here to restructure this a bit. And with that, we created our first view. It's really not too fancy. It's just a function that takes a request and sends back a response. And of course, we're not doing anything with the request here. Later we will, but we should still accept it. Now that alone is not enough though. Just by adding this function, Django has no chance of knowing when it should call this function. Should it call it for every incoming request, or only for incoming requests to /challenges or /challenges/January? When should it call this function? Well, that is something we need to tell Django. And for that, we save this views.py file and add another new file next to views.py inside of the challenges folder. And that's the urls.py file. Now we actually already have a urls.py file in that main project subfolder, the monthly challenges subfolder, but we need to add a new urls.py file next to views.py in the app we're working on. And in that urls.py file, we should create a new list. A list which we name URL patterns. And in Python, we create lists like this with square brackets. And in that list, we now want to list all the URLs we want to support. So something like challenges January, and then the view function that should be triggered when a request reaches that URL. And we do that by using a function Django exposes to us, the path function. Now we need to import this function. From Django URLs, we import path. That's a function we need here. And the path function then takes two arguments. The first argument is a string which describes the URL we want to support. So that could be challenges/January, but actually here it should be just January. And I'll come back to why it's just January in a second. So here our path is just January. The second argument then is a pointer at the view function that should be executed when a request reaches that URL. And for that, we need to reach out to the views.py file where I have this index function. So we want to import that views file, and we can do that with from dot import views. That is regular Python syntax for telling Python that from the same folder as the URLs.py file is in, so from that challenges folder, we want to import the views.py file. And then we can access views.index here, pointing at that index function defined in the views.py file. And with that, we're basically telling Django, if a request reaches /January, then execute this index view function. Now that's a first step, but it's not everything. This creates a so-called URL config, or often also called URL conf. We configure the URLs we want to support in this application and which views should be triggered for the incoming requests. Now this will not be enough though, because this is now a URL config defined in our challenges app, which is part of the overall monthly challenges project. Therefore, we now need to connect this challenges app to the entire project. We need to make the entire project URL config aware of the URL config for this specific app. And that's where we now dive into the URLs.py file in the monthly challenges folder. So in the main project setup folder, which is part of this project. There you see you already have URL patterns, and you already have a path in there, which you can ignore for now. And that's now where we want to add another path. We want to add another path here, and here I want to point at challenges. Not January, but challenges. And then I want to load all the URLs that are defined for the challenges app for the challenges URL. And we can do this with another function, which we can import from Django URLs, and that's the include function. With that here, we can call include, and to include, we pass a string where we say challenges.urls. So the app name, challenges, and then the file name where the URLs for that app are defined. And since it's URLs.py, it's .urls. You don't add the file extension here. It's really just app name and then file name of the URL config for that app. And here we should also add a trailing slash. Now with that, I'm saying that the overall Django application should handle requests which are sent to challenges, so localhost 8000/challenges, and should basically forward those requests internally on the server, you could say, to the URL config of the challenges app. And there we then parse the URL after the /challenges part, because we already forwarded only /challenges requests to the challenges URLs, and look at the part after /challenges, like /January thereafter, to then call a view function. Because of all of that, if we save all these files and we go back to our preview server, if we visit localhost 8000/challenges/January, we should see this works. Now, if you don't see that, attached you find a snapshot of my project, which you can use to compare your configuration and code to mine to find that tiny error you might have somewhere. But with that, we now registered our first view and the URL config for it. And the URL config is actually split across two URLs py files, one for the app, the challenges app, and one for the entire project. And the one for the entire project basically just is able to route requests that start with different paths, so these URL segments after the domain, to different apps you might have in your project. Here we only have one app, but we could of course have more apps. And then we say that all requests which start with /challenges after the domain should be forwarded, in quotes, it's not a technical forward, but internally it's forwarded to the challenges app. Then check the URL config there and see what comes after /challenges in this case. So here it's January. And then look for January in the URL config of this app to find out which view function should be called ultimately. And that is a core mechanism of Django, which is why I'm putting so much emphasis on it. That is one of the core fundamentals you have to understand when working with Django. When a client, so you using the browser, sends a request to a server running Python Django, then on that server, Python checks the URL config, or possibly, typically, multiple URL configs, one for the project and one for the app, which it's then forwarded to. Then you might have multiple view functions. We only have one here, but often you will have more than one, and we're going to add more than one soon. And depending on the URL that was entered, one specific view function will be executed, and that view can then do something with the request if it needs to, extract data, for example, but it then generates a response and sends back that response to the client. That's how this works. That's how URLs and views are working together. And now we're going to dive deeper into that and learn more about that. Now we added our first view function for January. Now I got a little exercise for you to make sure that we're all on the same page. I want you to add a second view for February, and of course also add a URL pattern for that month then, so that in the browser we can also enter challenges February, and we would load the challenge for February. At the moment, we get a 404 error here, a page not found error, because we're not supporting this URL at this point of time. This is a challenge for you. Here's a short pause for you to pause the video and try this on your own, and thereafter we're going to do this together. Were you successful? Let's try it together. To add a new view, we first of all have to go to the views py file in the challenges folder and add a new function, because every view is a standalone function. Now we could name this function February, and we get a request here, like this, so just as before, but now we return a HTTP response where we maybe say walk for at least 20 minutes every day. That could be our February challenge, and I will actually also rename this here to January now, and maybe set the challenge text here to eat no meat for the entire month. Now we got these two view functions, and with those functions added, we can go to URLs py, and first of all, change the existing path here and point at views.january, since I renamed that view function. But then also add a second entry to this URL patterns list, which is a path pointing at February, like this, where we want to load the February function. So where this view function should be executed if a request is sent to challenges/February. Now we don't need to change anything in the monthly challenges URLs py file, because there we still just want to forward all requests that start with challenges after the domain to our challenges URLs to then load these more specialized URLs and fire the specific view functions. With that all done and the development server still up and running, if I now try to visit /challenges/February, we see that challenge. And if we instead go to January, we see the January challenge. And that's how we can add a second view and the respective URL. Now, of course, in this application, in this first demo website which we're building here, it would make sense that we have a challenge for every month, not just for January and February. So therefore, what we could do is we could add more view functions, for example, also one for March, and then return a HTTP response here. And in March, we could maybe learn Django for at least 20 minutes every day. And we could do that for all months. So we do it for March, and we would also add a URL here for March. So we would add a new path here in the URL patterns where we point at views.march for the March URL. And we could do this for all months, but this, of course, will be quite cumbersome. We have to add 12 entries here to URL patterns, and we have to add 12 views here. And the good thing in this demo here is that we know how many entries we need. In a lot of other applications, you wouldn't have that luxury. Let's say you're building a blog where more and more blog posts are added over time. At the point of time you're writing this code, you might not know how many blog posts your users are going to add and which URLs they want for these blog posts. So often you have the scenario that you can't know all possible URLs in advance when you're building the application. And even if you do, in cases like this here with the months, it would be a lot of extra work to add all these extra view functions and all extra URL entries. Now, it would be better if we could instead kind of set this up dynamically. That we set up one URL pattern, which actually is dynamic regarding the concrete value here. If that's January, February, March, that it's dynamic regarding that. And that then we also have one view function which is triggered for this dynamic URL and which is able to find out with which concrete value the URL was populated to then return a different response based on that value. Does this make sense? Let's take a closer look, because that is a common requirement you have in a lot of applications and also something which helps us here. We could, for example, create a new function here, which we name monthly challenge. And we get the request here, and now we want to return a HTTP response, but the text which we send with the response is not always the same, but instead depends on the month for which this function is executed. Now that's the next step. Let's first of all find out how we could wire up this function. In URLs py in the challenges folder, we could add a path where we actually don't hard code the month name, but instead we add a placeholder. And Django supports this and has a built-in placeholder syntax. You use angle brackets, so a smaller than and greater than sign, and in between any identifier of your choice. For example, month. But this is totally up to you, this text. Now, what this tells Django is that you don't care about the concrete value. This could be January, February, March, December, October. You don't care, but instead you want to handle all URLs with any text after /challenges, which is still needed, but with any text thereafter, any URLs should be handled by views.monthlyChallenge. So by this new view function which we added. And with that, we can actually remove these other paths here and just have this one dynamic path with the dynamic path segment. And it's always this view here which will be triggered. Now, in this view, we now need to find out for which concrete path value this was triggered. So whether this function is executed because January was entered, February, or anything like that. So therefore, Django conveniently offers us a second argument which we receive here. And that's the month argument. It's month, and it's written exactly like this because I picked month as an identifier between the angle brackets. If you used a different identifier here, like just M or whatever, then you would have to use that different identifier here as an argument name. Because Django will pass in the concrete value, which is set here on the path, as a keyword argument to this view function. If you had multiple dynamic URL parameters, so multiple angle bracket statements here in one and the same URL, you could extract these different dynamic values by simply listing them by their name as parameters in the view function. So these act as keyword arguments which Django will use to forward the captured values for these dynamic parameters to the view function that is being executed. And in there, we could now check with the if statement, for example, if month is equal to January. And if it is, we then, for example, have a variable, which is our challenge text, which by default is none, let's say. And we then set this here equal to our January text. That's something we could do. And then we could repeat this for all months. So with elif, we could check if month is maybe equal to February. And if that's the case, we would set challenge text equal to this. And elif, if month is equal to March. And of course, I want to use double quotes everywhere to be consistent. Both would work in Python, but I want to be consistent. So if it's equal to March, I set challenge text equal to the March text here. And we can do this for every month now. And then at the end, check if else, if month is something else, then we want to do something else. Then we maybe don't want to send a response like this, but instead maybe want to send back a 404 response. And therefore, here in the else case, we could return another object, which we can import from Django HTTP. We can import the HTTP response not found. And that allows us to send back a 404 error. And with that here, we can return this response not found error and maybe set a value of this month is not supported. And otherwise, if we don't make it into this else block, so if we had a valid month, we send back a regular response, a success response, not an error response, with that challenge text which we populate for the respective months. And that's something we could do here. And with that, if we go back and we reload for January, we still see that value. We can also still visit February, and we can also visit March. But if I, for example, enter October here, this is not a value we're currently supporting with our if statement. I get back this month is not supported. And that's something we could do here. And now this is more dynamic with help of these dynamic path segments. And that is a super crucial feature without which you wouldn't be able to build many features which you need on web pages. And we're going to see this specific feature in action in many examples throughout the course. Of course, it means that now we can also get rid of the free view functions here, January, February, and March, and only go with the monthly challenge function, which now is called for whichever month is being entered. Of course, at the moment, we're not supporting more than these 3 months here, but being aware of these dynamic path segments is what I wanted to focus on now, and it is a super important feature. Now, we learned about these dynamic segments in the last lecture. Now, this is a super important feature. Now I want to take a closer look at it and dive a bit deeper into what we can do with these dynamic segments and also with responses we sent back in general. Now here we have this dynamic segment to hold any possible month value. And currently this simply will handle any request to localhost 8000/challenges/anything. Whatever you enter thereafter will be handled by this path. Why? Because it's the only path and because it has this placeholder segment here, which is matching anything which is being entered. Now, Django has one other neat feature related to the dynamic segments here, which can be useful from time to time. It is able to convert the concrete value which is entered in the URL, which is then caught by this path and passed as an argument to this view function, that this value can be converted to different types, most importantly to strings or numbers. So that, for example, here we know that our month should be a string, and therefore we can add str colon in front of our dynamic segment identifier. This tells Django that the concrete value entered here should be treated as a string and should be converted to a string. Now, why does this matter? Well, maybe we also want to support challenges/1, for example, and 1 should then represent January. At the moment, this also loads this monthly challenge because 1 is simply transformed to a string here. But maybe we want to add a new view here. Let's say the monthly challenge by number view function, which gets a request, and which also should get the month, but in there, month should not be a string, it should be a number. And there, we then, for the moment, want to return a HTTP response where we just output that parameter value which we're getting. Now, this view here, monthly challenge by number, should be triggered dynamically, but only if this segment here is a number. If it's a string instead, this other monthly challenges view should be triggered. This can be implemented with help of this helper transformation here. We can add a second path here and simply name it month as well, but add int colon in front of it. This tells Django that this segment should be transformed to an integer. And hence, only segments that can be transformed to an integer will match this path. And then here we want to trigger the monthly challenge by number function. The order here also matters. We first want to check for month being an integer and possibly convert it if it's convertible and call this view. And then only as a second step, if this dynamic segment is not a number, we want to check or want to call this other view here, which handles any other values basically. With those changes made, if we visit challenges/1, we see 1 here, which is our new view function doing some work. And if we instead enter February, we see that other text. And if I enter October, I still see that 404 text. And that's why this feature is convenient. It allows us to filter for numbers specifically and find out whether the dynamic segment is a number. It then also converts this into a number so that in this view, month will be of type number. And it allows us to run different logic based on the value type of the dynamic segment. Most importantly here, ints and strings. A similar concept does not exist for booleans, for example, but with instance strings we have the two main cases that we typically have in URLs where you might want to differentiate. Now here, this is just a little demo, of course, but this can come in handy, and that's why I did want to emphasize it here. Now still, I want to continue with it though, and I now want to make these two views truly a bit more helpful. I want to cover all 12 months, and I want to make sure that if we enter /1, for example, this is simply translated to January and forwards us to the January route. These are the things we're going to do in the next lectures. So let's now make this a bit more dynamic. And I'll start with the monthly challenge where all months should be covered. Now we could add more elif statements, but this will lead to a super long if block in the end. I rather want to make this more dynamic by adding a new variable here at the top of the file, which I'll name challenges or monthly challenges. And this should hold a dictionary. Now my idea here is that we have keys which look like this, so which hold the month names like January. And then as a value, I want to have the challenges for those months, like eat no meat for the entire month here for January. Now I'll repeat this for the other 2 months which we already got, like February, like this, and also March, where I copy in the March text like this. And then we want to add all the other months of the year. So we have April, and to save some time, I will just repeat the texts we already have on other months. Of course, feel free to come up with more distinct challenges for the different months here if you want. I'll just repeat those existing challenges to save time, and therefore I'll add May, June, and then of course also July, where we also want to eat no meat again, let's say. And August, where I want to walk for at least 20 minutes every day. And I then also have September, where I want to learn Django again. And I have October, where I want to eat no meat again. And we have November, where now we want to again walk every day. And last but not least, in December, it's again time for some Django education. So I'll grab that, enter this here, and that's the finished dictionary. Now we have all those months and the respective challenge texts as values. Now, why is this helpful? Well, now we can go to monthly challenge down there, to this view function, and replace this if check here essentially with some code where we access those keys here. So here we would have our challenge text, which is equal to monthly challenges, so this dictionary we just added, and there we access month. Month is that parameter which we get, which holds a value like January, February, and so on, and we access a key of that name in our monthly challenges dictionary to extract that value for the respective key, store that here, and return it. Now, of course, this could fail if month is not one of the keys here, and therefore we can simply add try catch here to try this code, and then handle any error we might be getting to return the HTTP response not found here. This month is not supported, which will then be sent back if month is basically not a valid key of that dictionary. So if it's not one of these months. If it is one of these months, challenge text should be set, and we return that challenge text. And we can also move that return statement here into our try block if we want. With that, if we save that, we should still be able to reload January, but now we can also visit October or December here and see our different goals for these different months. And if I enter something invalid, I still get my 404 response. So this is now more dynamic and is a leaner view function, which is definitely a better idea than having a long if statement in there. Now, of course, we also have our number months, like 1 and 2 and 12 and so on. And at the moment, this always just triggers this view function, where in the end, I just sent back that extracted number in the response. This is not too helpful, of course. We would rather do something else. For example, also send back this challenge text, or maybe redirect the user to the full month name, so that if I enter /1 here, Django actually redirects me and changes the URL to January. That's something we could want here. And that is also something which we can achieve with Django. Now, to achieve this, we can also use this dictionary here in monthly challenge by number and simply get our forward month, so the month to which we want to forward the request to which we want to change the URL, by reaching out to the monthly challenges dictionary, and then there we can call keys like this, which is a built-in method we can call on a dictionary object, which will return us a list of keys. And I have an example for you here. Here I created a test dictionary with 2 keys, test and test3, which hold values of test2 and test4. And if I call keys on that, what I get back is a list where test is the first value and test3, which is my second key, is the second value. And starting with Python 3.6, dictionaries are by default ordered in Python. So I can rely on the fact that the first key in my dictionary will be the first item in that list, since I'm using Python 3.9. So therefore, we don't need to use the extra ordered dict type or anything like that. Instead here, we can rely on the fact that January, if we call keys on monthly challenges, will be the first item in the generated list, February will be the second item, and so on. So since month in this view here will be 1, 2, 3, and so on, what we can do is we can get our keys here and actually maybe name this months, because that's the better description. Keys of this dictionary are simply the various months we have. And then we want to forward the user to the specific month that was picked here. So now months here will be a list of those months. And actually, to make it a real list, we should wrap this with the list function here, because otherwise it's just an object that looks like a list. Only by wrapping it with list, it's a real list. And month then, the argument which we're getting, which is that value from the URL, that dynamic segment of the URL, that can be used to access the specific month to which we want to redirect by index, by using this month which we get as an argument, which is part of the URL, as an index in this list. So the forward month then could be months for the given month index. Because month, keep in mind, will be a number because we converted to an integer here. And then we can use that as an index in that list. That's standard Python. Now we got this month to which we want to forward or redirect, if we want to call it like this. And now to tell Django to redirect, so to not send a response with a body that should be displayed, but instead to lead the browser to send a new request to the redirected URL, we send a different response here. We send a HTTP response redirect, which we therefore also have to import here. So from Django HTTP, we import HTTP response redirect. And that's then what I return here. I return HTTP response redirect, and that now wants the new URL, the new path, so the part after the domain to which we want to redirect. And that would be /challenges here. That's still part of the URL. /, and then we combine this with our redirect month. So with that month, we extracted from that list of months, which we got from our monthly challenges dictionary. Now this is just standard Python, but we're using this code to send a redirect. So to change the URL. Now let's have a look at the result to make this a bit clearer. If we save all of that, if you now enter /1 here, challenges /1, you are redirected to February. Why not to January? I'll come back to that in a second. But it generally works. If I enter 8 here, I'm forwarded to September. So you see that that URL changed automatically because we returned a redirect here. And a redirect simply tells the browser, hey, that URL which you wanted to visit, yeah, you can visit this, but actually it's not the final, the real URL you should be visiting. Here is that real URL, the value we return, and the browser then goes ahead and sends a new request to that redirected URL, hence reaching this view and getting the result back from that view. And you can see this down there in the terminal as well. We got a request sent to challenges 8, and the response was a 302 response, which might not tell you much, but which is a redirect response. Any response code starting with a 3 is a redirect. And therefore, the browser automatically sent another request to challenges September, since that was the redirect URL we passed with the redirect to the browser. So we gave the browser the information where to redirect to. Hence, the browser sent a new request to this URL and now got back a standard response. The 200 success code means that it's successful, that everything is fine. That's how this worked here. Now, why do we redirect to February if I enter 1 here? Because we use the month as an index, and of course lists in Python, like in many programming languages, start at the index 0. So what we should be doing here is deduct 1 from the month. So that if month is 1, we actually use index 0. If the month is 2, we use index 1. And with that, if we save this, if I enter challenges /1, I'm redirected to January, 5 redirects me to May, and 12 redirects me to December. Now, if I enter something else like 15, we of course get an error because that's an index we're not supporting here. So to finalize this view function here, we might want to add a if check here and check if month is actually greater than the length of months. So if we try to access a month which exceeds the number of months we have in that list, and if that's the case, we want to return an error or whatever you want to do. Here we could return a response not found error where we say invalid month. So now if we entered a month which is not actually supported, we return this error response. So if I now try visiting 15 again, I get invalid month. The same for 13. 12, on the other hand, redirects us to December. So I know that these were a lot of new concepts. I still hope it's clear what's going on here. If not, definitely go through these last lectures again, because these are core essentials. Working with requests and responses, working with the redirects, and reading the different values that are part of the URL, possibly converting them to ints and strings. These are all core features that are built into Django, which you will need in a lot of websites you're building with Django. Now, a lot of the code we wrote here in Views.py is standard Python though. A dictionary, converting a dictionary to a list, and accessing list items by index, that's all standard Python. So if you got some issues there, if something is unclear there, I strongly recommend that you also dive into those Python essentials and basics again, because of course you also need those in addition to knowing Django. But with that, let's now dig in a bit deeper and let's learn a bit more about Django and what we can do with requests and responses and so on. So now in the last lectures, we learned how we can write truly dynamic views by using dynamic path segments, and of course also by using some Python features like dictionaries and so on. And that's all good to have. Now we always strive for such dynamic solutions and dynamic approaches simply because that allows us to write less code and more maintainable code, which is easier to change. If we, for example, add a new month here, which is kind of unrealistic, I guess, but if we would have a 13th month, we would just have to add one new entry to this dictionary, and we wouldn't need to change anything about the code down there, because it pulls in all the information automatically from that dictionary. And that's always something we want to aim for. Now, there is one aspect in this file where we don't really have dynamic code though. And spotting it can be quite tricky if you're new to Django. Still, do you see something here which could be hard to maintain or which we might need to change unnecessarily if we change something else in this application? Well, it's this redirect URL here. I hard-coded /challenges in there. Now I need to add that here because I want to redirect to /challenges/month name if we enter something like 1, 2, 3, and so on. The problem with that is that this challenges path with which this redirect path starts is hard-coded in our project URL config here. We say that for any requests starting with /challenges, we want to include our challenges URLs. Now, what if I would change this to just challenge? So without an S here. I don't change it here. I don't change the challenges app folder name. I just change the path for which I want to reach into that challenges folder name here in the project-wide URL config. If we save that, if I try to visit challenges December, it breaks. But that's to be expected. If I enter /challenge/December without an S, it works though. But if I enter /challenge without an S /1, it again breaks because we redirect to challenges/January. We still have the S in there because I still need to change that in the views.py file. Here, I need to remove that S. Now that's the problem here. Of course, we're probably not going to change our URLs all the time, but it's also not unrealistic that in bigger websites, maybe also projects where a lot of colleagues are working on, we definitely might have such changes from time to time. And even worse than that, some small errors might then slip through, and we might change the URL in one part of our project, but not in all other parts, and we might not even detect this error until we deployed our application and visitors are actively facing that error. And that's of course something we want to avoid. Of course, we can avoid such errors by thoroughly testing everything, by searching for usages of /challenges, but it would be even better if this entire path here, this URL to which we want to redirect, would be constructed in a more dynamic way. And thankfully, that is something which is possible with Python and Django. We first of all need to give our URL a name, the URL to which we might want to construct a path later anywhere in our app. We can also by default give every URL which we set up a name. But we definitely want to give this URL path a name here so that we can use a little extra feature Django has for constructing paths pointing at that URL. For this, we simply add a third argument here to the path function which we're calling to set up that path. And here we add the name keyword argument. So this is a keyword argument defined by Django for this path function. And we set this equal to a string with a name value of your choice. For example, month challenge. But this name is up to you. Now that this URL has a name, we can use that name to construct paths, URLs, pointing at that registered URL. So for example, here, when we redirect, instead of hard coding the URL like this, we can construct our redirect URL or our redirect path by using another utility function Django exposes to us. Now that is a function we need to import from django.urls, and it is the reverse function. You need to add this import in the views.py file, and reverse allows us to create paths by referring to the names of these paths, of these URLs. We call reverse, and we then start with the name of our URL. So in my case here, I assigned month-challenge as a name. Hence here, I start by passing month-challenge as a first argument to reverse. Now, what does reverse do now? It now figures out how to correctly build a full path to this URL. And it takes into account that it needs to prefix this with challenge. So it would effectively build a path that looks like this, challenge. Now, of course, we also need to enter the concrete month name as part of the URL. We want something like challenge January here. And therefore, reverse takes a second argument, which now allows us to pass in any args we might need for this specific URL. Now, not all URLs require args, but in our application, they actually do. Both registered URLs we have for this challenges app do have a dynamic segment. And it's this dynamic segment which we want to pass in. So here, the args would be one argument, one value for this dynamic segment. So here, args actually is an array, because you could have URLs with multiple dynamic segments. Here we only have one dynamic segment though. And therefore, args is an array or a list with only one value. And that's the redirect month in our case. And redirect month will be something like January, February, March, and so on. Don't forget. And hence Python or Django, with help of the reverse function, will construct a string path that looks like this. Challenge, because of this, and then January, because we set this arg for this URL, which we identified by this name we set for this URL config for this entry here. And then it's this constructed redirect path which we want to use down there. And the great advantage here now is that we can now change that URL and also the parts leading up to that URL, like here in the main project URLs py file, however we want. As long as we don't change the name, which you typically don't do that often, you won't have any problems. So if I now save everything, if I visit challenge/January, that still works. But if I enter challenge/1, I'm also forwarded to the correct month challenge now. So this path is now being built correctly. And if I go to the main URLs py file and I change this back to challenges here, and I save that, if I now visit challenges/1, it automatically correctly forwards me to challenges January. So it keeps that S because we're not constructing our redirect path by hard coding the full path, but by instead pointing at the name of the URL, and Django then automatically figures out what the correct URL is here. And that is a super important feature. And whenever you are creating paths to which you want to redirect or to which you want to link, you really want to consider using that reverse function instead of manually hard coding the path. Because if you manually hard code, whenever you change something about the URL, like the S here, you will destroy all your hard coded paths and you will have to manually fix them. By using reverse, and named paths, named URLs, you won't have that problem. So that's the reverse function, a super important function. And now we got truly dynamic views here, which can deal with any months and which really work in a way that requires minimum input from us as a developer and where we can make changes without having to change dozens of places in our code base. And that's always what we want to aim for. So we learned about some important basics now, and our first demo application, this first simple web page, is slowly taking shape. We now learned about URLs and views and how they work together. To conclude this section and come to an end, I want to focus on the response we're sending back, and I also want to add another URL soon. But let's start with the response data to be precise. No matter if it's a not found response or a regular response, what I'm currently sending back is always just a string. It's just some text, some plain text. Challenge text here also holds just some text in the end because it holds the text we store as values in this dictionary. Now, sending back text as a response is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But typically, when you visit a website, what you see is something like this, not just some plain text as we have it here. Now, we see something like this because typically we don't just get back some plain text, but instead HTML content, where HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, which is basically code that can be parsed and understood by the browser. And it's then typically combined with CSS for cascading style sheets to add some styling to make this look beautiful and present the content in a visually pleasant way. So typically we send back HTML, very often combined with CSS. And at the moment in this demo application, we're not sending back either of the two. We don't have any styling here, and we don't even have HTML. If we view the page source here of this created page, it's really just plain text, not HTML. And that's not very realistic. If you are building real websites, you want to send back HTML so that the browser can parse this, understand this, also present it correctly to screen readers and so on. And, well, you simply want to have a real web page. Therefore, I now want to send back HTML here as well. I still won't add any styling for now. That's something we're going to do in the next course section, but I will start with some HTML. And for that, we could say that we don't want to send back the raw challenge text here, but instead we have the response data variable, and in there I want to have a string that holds some HTML. Let's say at least a h1 tag where we then wrap the selected challenge text. For this, we can use a Python feature which is called string interpolation, or f strings, where we add an f in front of a string, so in front of some text between quotes. And then inside of that string, we can basically inject values into that text so that we have the hard-coded opening and closing h1 tags, but in between we inject a value. And we can simply do that with curly braces here, and then in there refer to challenge text. And now the value selected or stored in the challenge text variable will be injected into this string. And now we can send back the response data here. Now by doing that, if we save this, what happens is that if I reload here, now this looks a bit different because now we get some real HTML code here. If I view the page source, we see the h1 tag here as well. And that is more realistic, that we want to send back HTML like this. Now, of course, I don't just want to send back HTML code here. We also might want to do this in other places. For example, here we could wrap our error message between h1 tags like this. Here I'm not using a formatted string. I'm not using string interpolation because having one single hard-coded HTML string is okay here because the message is always the same. And with that, if we have an invalid value here, this is now also HTML. Now that's good to have, that's nice to have. And with that, we took a step towards a more realistic application, at least a little bit. It's still not the final way on how we will return HTML in bigger applications, but it is a good start. Now, before we move on to the next section, where we will dive into templates and where we will learn how we can render and return more complex HTML documents, before we dive into that, I want to conclude this section by adding one more URL here. Because at the moment, we always have to manually enter the months which we want to visit here. And this is not very convenient and not very realistic. Instead, I would like to have the localhost 8000/challenges URL. And if I visit this, instead of getting this 404 error, it would be nice to get a list of all months where we then can click on the individual months to be taken to the respective URLs automatically. Now, if you feel like it, definitely try building this on your own. In the next lecture, we're going to implement this together. Now let's implement this together. And for this, I will start in the URLs py file in the challenges app folder and add a new path. And here, I simply want to have an empty path. So I won't enter anything here between the quotes, because you must not forget that this URL patterns list is reached for requests sent to challenges. So for domain/challenges. For those requests, we load the URLs in the challenges folder. So if we then there have a URL with an empty path, that will simply trigger for just /challenges/nothing. Because this is an empty string. So for nothing after /challenges, this path will be triggered. And then of course we also want to create a view for this. Because at the moment I don't have a function for this, and that's something I'll add here, maybe at the top. Here I want to add a new view function which I'll name index, because it has the goal of listing an index of all available months. The name is up to you. This is just a name which you will see quite often and which I guess makes a lot of sense. So I will go with that name. That's my index function here. And in there, of course, we want to return a HTTP response. HTTP response like this. And in there, as part of that response, as data, I want to return a list of months, and every list item should be a clickable link where we are taken to that month then. And there are various ways of doing that. We could, for example, hard code everything. We could add our response data here, and then create a string here, maybe actually a multi-line string to make this a bit easier to write here. And we can use triple quotes to create such a multi-line string. And then in there, we could create an unordered list like that. So that's some HTML content. And then have list items where for the first list item, we have an anchor tag with some reference, so with a link, which we'll have to add. And there we say January, and we want to link to challenges/January. And now we can repeat this for every month. But this approach has two main flaws. For one, I'm hard coding that path again, and that's not something we want to do. We instead want to use the reverse function we learned about to select the target URL by name and let Python, or Django to be precise, construct the full path. The second flaw about this approach is that we manually have to add all the code for all the months. And actually we already have a list of months here. These dictionary keys, that's a list of months. So a better approach might be to kind of generate this string here by just having unordered list tags, which then wrap the list item tags, which we generate dynamically by going through all the dictionary entries here and then adding them to the string step by step so that at the end we have an unordered list with all the list items for all the months, but it's generated automatically by code instead of hard-coded by us. And that's the approach I will follow here, though you can also go with the hard-coded approach if you prefer that. Now, how can we implement this? Well, I will start by adding a new variable in my index function here, which I'll name list items. And this will be an empty string initially. Then I will get my months, which should be a list, generated as we did it down there. So we can copy that code. We could also refactor it into a standalone function, but I will just quickly copy it. So now again, we'll have a list of all those month keys here. As a next step, we can then add a for loop here and simply go through all the month items in the months list to loop through all the keys we got in this months list. And then simply set list items plus equal to a f string where we have the list item tag and then the anchor tag with ref and also the closing anchor tag. And here we simply refer to month, maybe month.capitalize to capitalize the first letter. Alternatively, we add a new helper variable, capitalized month, where we call month.capitalize like this. And then here we inject just the capitalized month. And I also want to generate the path here. So the month path, which we create with the reverse function we learned about earlier. And here we want to basically construct it as we did down there. We want to take the URL with the name month challenge. So this name here. And we want to set the args, so this dynamic segment in the generated URL, which should be replaced with a concrete value, we'll set this concrete value here equal to month. Not to the capitalized month, but instead to the month as we have it here. So all lowercase. And then we inject this month path here as a value for this link. Now, one problem we'll have here is related to the quotes, of course, because I started my string with double quotes. So here we should escape these inner double quotes here. So now what we do is we loop through all the months, so all these keys here, and then we generate a new string for every month. This string, which holds a hard-coded list item tag and an anchor tag, but which has a dynamic path to which this link leads then, and which has a dynamic text inside of the link. And we add these link strings here to the list items string, which initially is an empty string, so that after every iteration, list items will hold more and more list item strings, so more strings of this kind. And therefore, after this for loop, this will basically be a long string of side-by-side list items. So here we'll then simply have all those list items side by side in the list items string after this for loop. And in every list item we have an anchor tag with some link, and we have January here, and then in the next list item we have February, and so on. That's the shape this list items variable will have after this for loop. And now it's this list items variable, which holds this long text of all the list items, which we want to inject into our response data string, which simply has the job of wrapping all these list items with an unordered list. And for that, of course, we can go back to a simple formatted string here, have our unordered list, and there I simply inject the list items string with all those list items. And then it's the response data which we sent back here. And that was a lot of work, but with that we're dynamically generating some HTML code here. Now, if I save that, I'm already getting an error down there that path is missing one required positional argument, and that makes sense because in that URL which I added earlier, I now want to point at that newly added views function. So I'll point at views.index, at this function we just added. And with all of that, if you save all the files, if you reload just localhost 8000/challenges, you should have a list of all these months. And you can click on these months to be taken to the challenges for the individual months. And that's this finished first basic website. It's not beautiful at all, definitely not. It does not have any styling, and it does not have a complete HTML document body. This is just some basic HTML, unstyled, but it has the core features, the core functionality you need to know if you're working with Python. And that's what this module was all about. So let me sum up what we learned in this module in the next lecture. And then in the next section, we're going to work on what we sent back. We're going to make this more beautiful and more realistic with a feature called templates. So in this course section, we learned about URLs and views. And instead of URLs, you will also sometimes hear the term routes. Routes for our application, URLs for our application. The concept is the same one though. The idea is that we have different paths, which is the part after the domain, so something like /nothing, /posts, /posts, /something else, and that for these different paths, we can trigger different actions. And these actions are our views. It's the logic that is executed for different URLs. And we can build them as a function or as a class, which we'll cover later. And then there we handle the incoming request and return a response. And we saw this in action in this module. We added a bunch of URLs and a bunch of views which are triggered for these different URLs. And we learned about important features like dynamic path segments, which basically consume any value that's entered and then allow you to run the same view function for different concrete values, which you sometimes need to build truly dynamic websites. On the other hand, sometimes, like here with the index path, you need a hard-coded single value, in this case an empty string, to handle the /nothing case, to then only trigger the index view for this specific URL, and not for any URL with any value thereafter. And we learned about both. We learned how to register our URLs, and that we register them on the app level to then also link them to the project-wide URLs. There we have the admin URL, which we're not using right now. And then we added this challenges path, which works like a prefix and forwards all requests that start with /challenges after the domain to our challenges URLs. Now in the views, we then learned how these view functions look like. They get the request, with which we're not doing much right now, and they also get any dynamic segments our URL might have. Then in there, we can run any logic we need to run to fulfill this request and create the response which we want to return. And we have different examples of the logic we could run there in those different view functions. Then ultimately, those views are always about returning a response. For example, a response full of HTML code that is being sent back to the client. Simply some text that contains HTML code. Or we return a redirect. If we know that we want to send a response, but we actually want to get the browser who sent the request to visit another page, then we can use a redirect. Sometimes we also don't find the resources we want to work with, or we have some error working with the data we got from the client. In such cases, we could send back a not found response, as we're also doing it here. Now, there are other errors we could be sending back as well, and other responses. But these are the important basics and the responses which you typically will use the most. Now, we then also sometimes might want to construct our own URLs. We want to construct links to other URLs of our website. And for this, we can use the reverse function. The reverse function allows us to build URLs dynamically without hard coding them. We identify them by name, and that's why we can assign names here. And then we can build such a URL dynamically and use that however we want to use it, for example, for redirecting or for generating a link in HTML, like we're doing it here in the index view. And that's essentially it. Now, throughout the course, we will also learn how to extract data from the incoming request. We're going to learn how to send back real HTML documents where we store the HTML code in separate files. And we're also going to learn how we talk to a database and much more. But these essentials here, which we learned in this module, will always matter. And that's why I spent so much time on this module. With that, let's now continue.